What happens when a simple farm girl with dirt under her fingernails walks into the most advanced military facility in the country and claims she doesn't need their million-dollar computers? In just 60 seconds, she would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't technology, it's the human mind that knows how to use it. Sarah Mackenzie had never seen so much concrete in one place. The military base stretched endlessly before her, a maze of grey buildings and satellite dishes that looked nothing like the rolling wheat fields of her family's farm in Nebraska. She clutched her worn backpack tighter as she approached the main gate, her boots still carrying traces of the morning's chores. The security guard looked her up and down with barely concealed amusement. Her faded jeans, simple cotton shirt, and the small-town innocence written across her face clearly marked her as someone who didn't belong in this world of classified operations and cutting-edge technology. "Name and purpose of visit," the guard said, his tone suggesting he already knew this would be brief. "Sarah Mackenzie, I'm here to see General Morrison about the cyber defense position." The guard's eyebrows shot up. He checked his computer screen twice, clearly believing there had been some mistake. After a few phone calls and several confused conversations, Sarah found herself being escorted through corridors lined with portraits of decorated officers and walls covered in technical diagrams she couldn't begin to understand. General Morrison's office was exactly what Sarah had expected: all polished wood, military memorabilia, and an intimidating desk that probably cost more than her family's annual seed budget. The man behind it looked like he'd stepped out of a recruiting poster: perfectly pressed uniform, stern expression, and the kind of confidence that came from years of commanding respect. "Miss Mackenzie," he said, not bothering to stand, "I have to admit your application was unexpected. Tell me, what makes a farm girl from Nebraska think she can handle national cybersecurity?" Sarah had practiced this moment during the long bus ride from home. But sitting in this imposing office surrounded by the weight of military authority, her prepared speech seemed inadequate. Instead, she found herself speaking from the heart. "Sir, I know I don't look like much compared to all those computer experts you probably interview. I don't have fancy degrees or certifications with long names, but I've been protecting my family's farm from threats since I was 12 years old." General Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly skeptical. "Miss Mackenzie, with all due respect, keeping raccoons out of a cornfield is hardly comparable to defending against sophisticated cyber attacks from hostile nations." "You're right," Sarah said, surprising him with her agreement. "It's much harder." The general's expression shifted from condescension to curiosity. "Explain." Sarah took a deep breath, drawing on years of experience that had taught her to see patterns others missed. On a farm, threats don't announce themselves with warning labels. You have to read the signs. A change in animal behavior, unusual weather patterns, the way crops respond to stress. Last year, we had a problem with our irrigation system. Everyone said we needed expensive new equipment, but I spent time watching, learning, understanding how water moved through our fields." She paused, meeting the general's gaze steadily. "I discovered that our real problem wasn't the system itself. It was that someone was stealing water upstream. They'd been clever about it, taking just enough to hurt us without being obvious. I tracked their pattern, figured out their schedule, and caught them red-handed." "Interesting," the general admitted. "But this position requires technical expertise. Our systems are incredibly complex." "Complexity doesn't scare me, sir. Our farm runs on systems too: crop rotation, soil management, weather prediction, market timing. Everything connects to everything else. One small mistake in timing or judgment can destroy a year's work. I've been managing interconnected systems my whole life." General Morrison stood and walked to his window, looking out at the base's technological landscape. "Miss Mackenzie, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't about managing crops. We're talking about protecting classified information, preventing cyber warfare, staying ahead of some of the most sophisticated hackers in the world. And they're probably very good at what they do," Sarah said. "But I'm willing to bet they think like you do, that bigger and more complex is always better. Sometimes the best defense is understanding that simple doesn't mean stupid." The general turned back to her, his interest genuinely piqued now. "Give me an example." Sarah thought for a moment. "We had a problem with coyotes killing our chickens. Tried everything: better fences, guard dogs, motion sensors, even hired a professional trapper. Nothing worked. Then my grandmother suggested we try something she learned as a kid. We got a donkey." "A donkey?" "One donkey. Cost us $200 and some hay. Those coyotes never bothered our chickens again. See, everyone was thinking about how to catch or kill the coyotes. The donkey just made them not want to be there in the first place." General Morrison was quiet for a long moment. You're suggesting that instead of building bigger firewalls, we should find ways to make hackers not want to attack us? I'm suggesting that maybe the solution isn't always more technology. Maybe it's understanding behavior, reading patterns, thinking like the threat instead of just trying to overwhelm it. The general sat back down, his demeanor noticeably different. Our current cyber defense team is some of the best in the world. They've got advanced degrees from MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon. They work with artificial intelligence, quantum encryption, systems so sophisticated that most people can't even pronounce their names correctly.
And how well is that working for you?
The blunt question hung in the air. General Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, and Sarah realized she'd hit closer to home than she'd intended. We've had challenges, he admitted carefully. Sophisticated attacks that our system should have caught but didn't. It's almost like the attackers understand our defenses better than we do. Maybe they do, Sarah said. If I wanted to steal eggs from a farm, and I knew that farm had the fanciest security system money could buy, what would I study? I'd study the security system. I'd learn everything about how it works, what it watches for, what makes it trigger alerts. And then I'd find a way around it that the system couldn't recognize. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gaining confidence. But if that same farm had a farmer who knew every sound, every shadow, every smell of their land, I'd have a much harder time. Because the farmer isn't following a program or looking for specific triggers. The farmer knows when something feels wrong, even if they can't explain why. General Morrison steepled his fingers, studying this unlikely candidate with new eyes. You're talking about intuition. I'm talking about understanding. Computers are incredible tools, but they only know what they're programmed to know. They can process information faster than any human, but they can't feel when something doesn't fit the pattern. They can't sense when normal behavior is just a little too normal, or when someone is trying too hard to look legitimate. And you think you can do that? Sense digital threats the way you sense threats to your farm? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the weight of the question. I don't know if I can, sir, but I know I can learn. And I know that every expert you've got has learned to see threats through the lens of technology. Maybe what you need is someone who can see them through the lens of behavior. The general stood again, this time walking to a filing cabinet where he retrieved a thick folder. Miss Mackenzie, I'm going to share something with you that's classified. 3 months ago, we suffered a significant security breach. Someone got into our systems and had access for almost 2 weeks before we detected them. He placed the folder on his desk but didn't open it. Our analysis showed that the attack was incredibly sophisticated. The hackers used advanced AI to mimic normal user behavior, constantly adapting to avoid detection. They stayed under the radar of every security system we had. But you caught them eventually. Actually, no, they left. Just disappeared one day. We think they got whatever they came for and decided to exit before being discovered. The only reason we know they were there at all is because one of our senior analysts noticed that data queries were happening at slightly different times than usual. Not different enough to trigger alerts, but different enough that someone who'd been watching those patterns for years felt something was off. Sarah felt a spark of recognition, like knowing your cows too well to be fooled by one that doesn't quite belong to the herd. Exactly like that. The general opened the folder and showed her pages of technical analysis, code fragments, and timeline charts. This represents millions of dollars in damage and months of investigation by our best people. And it was detected by someone who trusted their instincts over their instruments. For the first time since entering the office, Sarah felt like she might actually belong here. What happened to that analyst? She retired the following month. 40 years of service, and she said she was tired of being told that computers could do her job better than she could. General Morrison closed the folder. That's when I started thinking that maybe we'd gotten so focused on upgrading our technology that we'd forgotten to upgrade our understanding. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A young officer entered, his face flushed with urgency. Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation in the command center. There's some kind of anomaly in the Eastern Sector's communication network, and the automated systems can't identify the source. General Morrison looked at his watch, then at Sarah. Miss Mackenzie, would you like to see what a modern military cyber defense operation looks like? The command center was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined. Dozens of enormous screens covered the walls, displaying scrolling data, network diagrams, and real-time status reports in colors that pulsed and shifted like a digital heartbeat. Technicians sat at workstations equipped with multiple monitors, their fingers flying across keyboards as they analyzed streams of information that moved too fast for Sarah to follow. This is our central nervous system, General Morrison explained as they walked through the controlled chaos. Every communication, every data transfer, every digital breath taken by this base gets monitored, analyzed, and logged. We can detect threats from anywhere in the world and respond in real time. Sarah watched the technicians work, noting their intense focus and obvious expertise. These weren't people playing games. They were professionals dealing with real threats to national security. She felt a moment of doubt about her ability to contribute meaningfully to this environment. The anomaly started about an hour ago, explained Dr. Peterson, the lead cyber analyst. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the intense demeanor of someone who lived in the digital world more comfortably than the physical one. We're seeing irregular communication patterns in the eastern sector, but our systems can't identify a cause. What kind of irregularities? General Morrison asked. Data packets are being transmitted at slightly different intervals than normal. The timing variations are minimal. We're talking microseconds, but they're consistent enough to suggest intentional manipulation rather than random network fluctuation. Sarah found herself drawn to one of the main displays, watching the flow of data represented as streams of light moving across a network map. Something about the pattern felt familiar, though she couldn't immediately place why. Have you considered that it might be someone testing your response protocols? She asked quietly. Dr. Peterson looked at her with barely concealed irritation. Excuse me, but this is a secure facility. Civilians aren't supposed to... Kiss! She's here on my invitation. General Morrison interrupted. Please continue, Miss Mackenzie. Sarah felt all eyes in the room turn to her, and for a moment, the weight of their expectations was overwhelming. She took a breath and focused on what she was seeing rather than who was watching. On our farm, we have automatic systems for monitoring soil moisture, temperature, and irrigation timing. Last spring, those systems started showing tiny irregularities. Nothing dramatic, just small variations in timing and data collection. Everyone assumed it was normal system aging or minor calibration drift. She pointed to the display showing the communication patterns. But I noticed that the irregularities followed a pattern. They happened more often during certain weather conditions and at specific times of day. When I mapped them out, I realized something was systematically testing our system responses. Testing for what? Dr. Peterson asked, his skepticism evident. To learn how long it took us to notice problems. Turned out a competitor was planning to make us an offer for our land. They wanted to know exactly how sophisticated our operation was and how quickly we could adapt to challenges. The testing was their way of gathering intelligence without triggering obvious alarms. The room fell silent as the implications of her observations sank in. General Morrison walked closer to the main display, studying the patterns with new eyes. You're suggesting that someone is testing our detection capabilities. I'm suggesting that these irregularities might not be random glitches or even a real attack. They might be reconnaissance. Someone learning exactly how sensitive your systems are and how long it takes your people to notice something unusual. Dr. Peterson turned back to his workstation, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up additional data. If that were true, we should see corresponding patterns in our response logs, timestamps showing when each irregularity was detected, how long analysis took, what resources were allocated to investigation. As the data populated his screen, his expression gradually changed from skepticism to concern. General, she might be onto something. Our response times are remarkably consistent and the irregularities seem to be designed to stay just below our standard alert thresholds. Which means someone has been studying us long enough to understand exactly how our systems work and how we respond to potential threats. They're essentially mapping our entire defensive posture without triggering a single alarm. General Morrison turned to Sarah with a look that mixed respect and amazement. In 15 minutes, you've identified something that our systems and our experts missed for over an hour. Sarah felt a flush of pride but tried to remain focused. It's not that your people aren't good at what they do. It's just that sometimes you need someone who isn't thinking like a technician to see what the technology can't show you. What would you recommend we do about it? The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized that this was more than an interview question. They were genuinely asking for her professional opinion. The weight of responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. Don't change anything yet, she said carefully. If someone is testing you and you suddenly change your responses, they'll know you're onto them. Instead, start feeding them information you want them to have. Elaborate. Let them think they're successfully mapping your system, but make sure the map they're creating is wrong. Adjust your response times in ways that look natural but give false information about your actual capabilities. Lead them to believe you're less sophisticated than you are, or that your weak points are somewhere other than where they actually exist. Dr. Peterson was nodding now, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine engagement. We could create false patterns in our response protocols, make it look like we have blind spots in areas where we're actually strongest. Exactly, Sarah said, gaining confidence. And, while they're studying the fate map you're giving them, you use the time to study them. Learn their patterns, understand their methods, figure out what they're really after. General Morrison walked to the center of the room, his voice carrying clearly to every technician and analyst present. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. Miss Mackenzie here has just demonstrated something that I think we've forgotten in our pursuit of technological superiority. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. She's shown us that the most sophisticated weapon in any conflict isn't the hardware or the software. It's the ability to think like your opponent while refusing to be limited by the same assumptions they make about how you should think. The room remained silent, but Sarah could see in the faces around her that something had shifted. These highly trained professionals were beginning to see her not as an outsider who didn't belong, but as someone who brought a different kind of expertise to their team. Dr. John Peterson, the general continued, I want you to work with Miss Mackenzie to develop a response strategy for this reconnaissance attempt. Use her insights about behavioral patterns combined with your technical expertise. Yes, sir, Dr. Peterson replied. And for the first time, he looked at Sarah with something approaching respect. As the immediate crisis began to transform into a strategic opportunity, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation that had brought her to this moment. She'd come here hoping to prove that her unconventional background could be valuable in a high-tech environment. Instead, she was discovering that the divide between traditional and technological thinking might not be as wide as everyone assumed. The afternoon passed quickly as Sarah worked alongside the cyber defense team, translating her intuitive understanding of behavioral patterns into technical strategies they could implement. She found that many of the principles that govern farm management applied surprisingly well to cybersecurity. The importance of understanding natural cycles, the value of patience in observing before acting, the recognition that the most dangerous threats often came disguised as normal behavior. As the workday drew to a close, General Morrison approached her workstation where she was reviewing network analysis reports with Dr. Peterson. Miss Mackenzie, I have to ask, what made you think you wanted to do this kind of work? It's quite a leap from agriculture to cybersecurity. Sarah saved the document she was working on and turned to face him. It started with a conversation I had with my grandfather before he passed away last year. He served in World War II, and he used to tell stories about how the war was won not just with superior weapons, but with superior thinking. She gestured toward the screens around them. He said that every generation faces the same basic challenge, protecting what matters from people who want to take it or destroy it. The tools change, but the fundamental principles stay the same. Understand your enemy, know your own strengths and weaknesses, and never assume that having better equipment means you'll automatically win. Wise man, General Morrison said. He was. And he used to say that the most dangerous mistake any defender could make was believing that their defensive tools were more important than their defensive thinking. Sarah paused, reflecting on the day's events. When I read about cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, attacks that affected farms and rural communities, I realize that the same principles my grandfather taught me about protecting our land could apply to protecting our digital infrastructure. Peterson looked up from his analysis. Your grandfather sounds like he understood something that we sometimes forget in this field. That technology is only as good as the intelligence behind it. That's exactly what he would have said, Sarah agreed. He believed that the best defense was always a combination of good tools and good thinking. But if you had to choose between them, thinking would beat tools every time. General Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Miss Mackenzie, I'm going to be direct with you. When I agreed to this interview, it was largely as a courtesy to Senator Williams, who spoke very highly of your analytical abilities. I expected to spend 20 minutes politely explaining why this position requires extensive technical training. He gestured toward the command center around them. Instead, I've spent the day watching you identify a sophisticated reconnaissance operation that our best systems missed, develop a counter-strategy that our most experienced analysts agreed was sound, and demonstrate that some of our assumptions about cyber defense might need serious reconsideration.
Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she sensed the direction this conversation was heading.
The position we discussed is for a junior analyst, someone who would spend months in training before being given any real responsibility. But I'm thinking that might be the wrong approach. The general paused, seemingly weighing his words carefully. How would you feel about a different kind of role? One where you'd work directly with our senior team to develop new approaches to threat detection and analysis. The offer was more than Sarah had dared to hope for, but it also carried weight that made her momentarily uncertain. "Sir, I'm honored by your confidence, but I want to be honest. There's still a lot I don't know about the technical side of this field. And there's a lot our technical experts don't know about thinking outside the constraints of their training," General Morrison replied. "The question is whether you're willing to learn their language while teaching them yours." Sarah thought about her family's farm, about the simple life she'd be leaving behind, and about the opportunity to contribute to something larger than herself. She thought about her grandfather's stories and his belief that every generation needed people willing to stand between what mattered and those who would destroy it. "Yes, sir. I'm willing." As the day ended and Sarah prepared to leave the base, she realized that her life had changed in ways she was still processing. She'd come here as an outsider hoping to prove herself, but she was leaving as someone who'd been invited to help reshape how one of the nation's most important institutions thought about security. Walking past the same guard who'd looked at her with amusement that morning, she noticed that his expression was different now. Respectful, almost curious. Word had apparently spread about the farm girl who'd identified a threat that the computers had missed. As her bus pulled away from the base, Sarah looked back at the complex of buildings and satellite dishes that would soon become her workplace. Tomorrow, she'd start the process of learning to translate her instincts into the language of cybersecurity, but tonight, she was content to watch the familiar landscape of rural America pass by her window and think about how sometimes the most important innovations came from the most unexpected places. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mackenzie sat in what had become her unofficial workspace in the corner of the command center, surrounded by monitors displaying network traffic patterns and behavioral analysis reports. The transition from farm life to military cybersecurity had been intense, but she was beginning to find her rhythm in this digital landscape. Her mornings now started at 5 a.m., not with feeding livestock and checking crops, but with reviewing overnight network logs and threat assessments. The habits of early rising and careful observation that had served her on the farm translated surprisingly well to monitoring the constant flow of digital information that kept the base secure. "Sarah, you need to see this," Dr. Peterson called from his workstation. Over the past weeks, their working relationship had evolved from skeptical tolerance to genuine collaboration. He'd discovered that her ability to spot patterns in data often led to insights that his technical training alone couldn't provide. She walked over to find him staring at a display showing communication logs from the past 72 hours. The data looked normal at first glance: routine military communications, standard data transfers, regular system maintenance protocols. But something in Peterson's expression told her to look deeper. "What am I looking for?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "That's just it. I'm not sure. But you taught me to trust when something feels wrong, even if I can't immediately identify what it is." He highlighted several sections of the log. "These communications all appear legitimate, but there's something about their timing that's bothering me." Sarah studied the highlighted data, letting her eyes unfocus slightly so she could see patterns rather than individual entries. It was a technique she'd developed while watching crop growth patterns. Sometimes you had to stop looking at individual plants to see what the field as a whole was trying to tell you. "It's too regular," she said after several minutes of observation. "Real human communication has natural variations. People take coffee breaks, have meetings, respond to emails at different speeds depending on their workload. But these communications are happening at intervals that are just a little too precise." Peterson nodded, pulling up additional analysis tools. "That's what I was thinking, but I wanted confirmation before I raised any alarms. The intervals aren't computer precise, but they're more consistent than human behavior typically allows for. Like someone is trying to mimic human patterns but doesn't quite understand the subtle irregularities that make them genuinely human," Sarah observed. "On the farm, we learned to tell the difference between real animal distress calls and recordings used by hunters. The recordings were technically accurate, but they lacked the small variations that real animals include naturally. As they dug deeper into the data, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Someone was indeed using artificially generated communications to maintain a presence within their network, but this wasn't the relatively obvious reconnaissance they dealt with weeks earlier. This was something more sophisticated and potentially more dangerous. "General Morrison needs to see this immediately," Peterson said, reaching for his secure phone. Within minutes, the command center was buzzing with activity as senior analysts and security officers gathered around their workstation. General Morrison arrived with his aide and the base's intelligence officer, Colonel Martinez. "Walk me through what you found," the general said without preamble. Sarah took the lead, explaining their analysis in terms that combined her behavioral insights with Peterson's technical expertise. "Sir, We believe someone has successfully inserted artificial communications into our network that are designed to look like legitimate human activity. The patterns are too consistent to be natural, but not obviously artificial enough to trigger automated detection. Colonel Martinez frowned as she studied the data. If someone can generate false communications that convincingly, what's their endgame? Are they trying to mask other activities? That's what we need to determine, Sarah replied. But, based on what I've learned about deception patterns, I'd guess they're creating background noise to hide something much more specific. General Morrison studied the displays for several moments before speaking. Recommendations? Sarah and Peterson exchanged glances. They'd discussed this possibility while waiting for the senior staff to arrive, but the recommendation they wanted to make was ambitious and potentially controversial. Sir, we think we need to set a trap, Sarah said, but it's going to require us to take some calculated risks. Explain. Peterson pulled up a new display showing network topology and traffic flow. If our analysis is correct, whoever is doing this believes they're successfully masquerading as legitimate users. They think their artificial communications are providing perfect cover for whatever they're really doing. So we let them keep thinking that, while we trace their real activities, Colonel Martinez said, standard counterintelligence approach. Not exactly, Sarah interrupted gently. We think we should do something more aggressive. Instead of just watching them, we should start feeding their artificial communication system false information about our network structure and capabilities. The room fell silent as the implications of her suggestion sank in. General Morrison's expression was unreadable as he considered the proposal. You want to engage in active deception against an unknown hostile entity operating within our network. I want to turn their own deception against them, Sarah clarified. Right now, they think they understand our system well enough to hide inside it. But if we can manipulate what they think they know, we can control where they go and what they try to access. Colonel Martinez stepped closer to the displays. That's a significant escalation in risk. If we're wrong about our analysis, we could be compromising our own security. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of the risk, then drew on an analogy that had served her well in previous explanations. Colonel, imagine you discover that someone has been sneaking onto your property at night. You could just install better security and hope to keep them out. Or you could set up a situation where they think they know the layout of your property but actually guide them exactly where you want them to go. And if they realize they're being guided, then we learn that they're more sophisticated than we thought, and we gain valuable intelligence about their capabilities. But if we're right about their methods, they won't realize it because the false information will be delivered through their own artificial communication system. General Morrison walked to the main display, staring at the network visualization as if it could reveal the hidden intruder through sheer force of will. Dr. Peterson, what's your assessment of the technical feasibility? Sir, it's complex but doable. We'd essentially be creating a false layer of network information that gets fed to their artificial communications. From their perspective, they'd be receiving what appears to be legitimate intelligence about our systems, but it would actually be a carefully constructed deception. Timeline? 48 hours to set up the basic framework, another 24 to test and implement. Peterson replied without hesitation. But sir, we'd need additional resources and approval from the intelligence division. Colonel Martinez was already pulling out her secure tablet. I can have the authorization process started within the hour, assuming this operation gets command approval. 2. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she watched her unconventional idea being transformed into a formal military operation. 3 weeks ago, she'd been feeding chickens and checking irrigation systems. Now she was proposing counterintelligence strategies that could affect national security. Miss Mackenzie, General Morrison said, drawing her attention back to the immediate moment. I want you to understand something clearly. If we proceed with this operation and it goes wrong, there will be serious consequences. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? The question hung in the air, and Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention. This was her moment to either commit fully to her new role or step back into a safer, more limited position. Sir, I understand the risks. But I also understand that doing nothing while someone operates freely within our network is also a serious risk. Sometimes the most dangerous choice is the one that feels safest. The general studied her for several seconds before nodding. Colonel Martinez, initiate the authorization process. Dr. Peterson, begin preliminary technical preparations. Miss Mackenzie, I want you to work with our behavioral analysis team to refine the deception strategy. As the group began to disperse to their various tasks, General Morrison caught Sarah's arm gently. Walk with me for a moment. They moved to a quieter section of the command center, away from the bustling activity of the main workstations. The general's expression was serious but not unfriendly. Sarah, in 3 weeks you've gone from farm girl to strategic operations planner. That's an extraordinary transition, and you've handled it remarkably well. But I need to ask you something directly. Are you ready for what comes next? I'm not sure I understand, sir. What I mean is this. If your strategy works, you're going to be recognized as someone who can think outside conventional frameworks and solve problems that our traditional approaches can't handle. That recognition will come with opportunities, but also with pressures and expectations that could change your life significantly. Sarah thought about his words, considering not just the immediate implications, but the longer-term trajectory he was describing. General, 3 weeks ago I was worried about whether our corn crop would survive an early frost. Today I'm planning counterintelligence operations against sophisticated cyber adversaries. I'm not sure anyone could be fully ready for this kind of change. Fair point, he acknowledged. But the question is whether you want this kind of responsibility, or whether you stumbled into it and now feel obligated to continue. The directness of the question forced Sarah to examine her own motivations more honestly than she had since arriving at the base.
Sir, I'd be lying if I said this wasn't intimidating.
But I'd also be lying if I said it wasn't exactly what I hoped for when I applied for this position. Even knowing that success could mean spending your career dealing with threats that most people can't even imagine. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the path that had led her from her grandfather's stories about protecting what mattered to this conversation about national cybersecurity. General, when I was growing up, my grandfather used to tell me that every generation inherits certain responsibilities, whether they ask for them or not. The choice isn't whether to accept those responsibilities, the choice is whether to meet them competently or poorly. General Morrison smiled slightly, the first time Sarah had seen him show genuine warmth since their initial meeting. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. He was. And he taught me that running away from difficult responsibilities doesn't make them disappear, it just means someone else has to handle them, possibly someone less capable or less committed. Then you're ready to see this operation through to its conclusion, whatever that might be?
Yes, sir.
I am. The next 48 hours transformed the command center into a hive of controlled urgency. Technical specialists worked around the clock to construct the deception framework that would feed false information to the artificial communication system. Intelligence analysts developed carefully crafted misinformation designed to misdirect the hidden intruders while appearing completely legitimate. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, translating between the technical requirements of the operation and the behavioral insights that would make the deception believable. It was exhausting work, but also exhilarating in a way that reminded her of harvest time on the farm, that sense of everything coming together under pressure, with success dependent on careful planning and flawless execution.
The framework is ready, Peterson announced during a briefing on the second evening.
We've created what essentially amounts to a parallel information environment. Their artificial communication system will receive network data that appears completely legitimate, but actually describes a different version of our security infrastructure. Colonel Martinez reviewed the operational parameters on her tablet. Intelligence Division has approved the deception content. We've crafted information that will make them believe our strongest security measures are in different locations than they actually are, and that our response protocols follow patterns they don't actually follow.
What about containment?
General Morrison asked. If this goes wrong, how do we limit the damage? We've built multiple fail-safe mechanisms, Peterson explained. The false information is compartmentalized, so even if they realize they're being deceived, they won't gain any real intelligence about our actual systems. And we've designed the deception to be immediately reversible, if necessary. Sarah had been quiet during most of the briefing, but now she raised a concern that had been bothering her as they approached implementation. Sir, I keep thinking about something my grandfather used to say about hunting. The most dangerous moment isn't when you're stalking your prey. It's when you think you've cornered it. Meaning? Meaning we need to be prepared for the possibility that we're not dealing with a passive reconnaissance operation. If whoever is doing this realizes they've been detected and deceived, they might decide to abandon stealth and attempt immediate maximum damage. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Colonel Martinez was the first to speak. You're suggesting they might have prepared for the possibility of discovery by building in some kind of scorched earth response. I'm suggesting that anyone sophisticated enough to maintain artificial communications within our network for this long probably has contingency plans we haven't considered. General Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Recommendations? We implement the deception as planned, but we also prepare for immediate network isolation if we detect any signs of aggressive behavior. Think of it like having fire suppression systems ready when you're doing controlled burning. Peterson was already pulling up additional technical displays. We can configure automatic isolation protocols that would segment critical systems if we detect any unauthorized access attempts beyond their current scope. Do it, General Morrison ordered. But I want multiple manual overrides built in. If this situation escalates, I want human judgment controlling our responses, not just automated systems. As the final preparations were completed and the operation moved from planning to execution, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation with General Morrison about responsibility and readiness. She was about to help implement a strategy that could either neutralize a significant threat to national security or potentially provoke that threat into more dangerous action. The weight of that responsibility was unlike anything she'd experienced, even during the most challenging seasons on the farm. Crop failures could devastate a family's finances, but network security failures could affect millions of people and compromise national defense capabilities. Ready? Peterson asked from his workstation. Sarah took a deep breath, centering herself in the same way she had before, every important decision on the farm, by focusing not on the potential consequences of failure, but on the careful preparation and sound reasoning that had brought them to this point. Ready, she confirmed. Peterson initiated the deception protocol, and false information began flowing through the artificial communications system they'd identified. On multiple monitors around the command center, technical staff tracked the implementation in real time, watching for any signs that their targets were detecting the manipulation. For the first several hours, everything proceeded exactly as they'd hoped. The artificial communications continued their regular patterns, apparently accepting the false network information as legitimate intelligence. Their hidden adversaries seemed to be proceeding with whatever plan they'd been developing, unaware that they were now working with deliberately corrupted data. Then, just after midnight, something changed. General, we have a problem, called out Sergeant Williams from the monitoring station. The artificial communications just shifted pattern. Instead of their regular intervals, they're now generating bursts of activity every few minutes. Sarah moved quickly to Williams' workstation, studying the new pattern with growing concern. This isn't random. They're not panicking or trying to escape. This looks like... Like what? General Morrison demanded. Like they're implementing a predetermined protocol. The pattern is too organized to be reactive. I think they've moved to phase 2 of whatever they're doing. Peterson was frantically analyzing the new data streams. She's right, sir. The content of their artificial communications has changed too. Instead of mimicking routine military communications, they're now generating what appears to be administrative data personnel records, supply chain information, maintenance schedules. Colonel Martinez paled as she realized the implications. They're not trying to break into secure military systems. They're trying to disrupt base operations by corrupting our administrative infrastructure. Can we stop them? General Morrison asked. We can try network isolation, Peterson replied. But if they've already infiltrated administrative systems, cutting them off from external access might not prevent them from causing internal damage. Sarah stared at the displays, her mind racing through possibilities and countermeasures. Suddenly, a memory from the farm surfaced, dealing with a computer virus that had infected their crop management software several years earlier. Wait, she said. Don't isolate them yet. What if we do the opposite? Explain quickly, the general ordered. What if instead of cutting them off, we give them exactly what they seem to want? Complete access to administrative systems, but we make sure those systems are feeding them false information about base operations. Peterson looked up from his analysis. You want to expand the deception rather than contain the intrusion? I want to make them think they're succeeding while ensuring they can't actually disrupt anything important. Like setting up a decoy barn for thieves while hiding your real livestock somewhere else. Colonel Martinez was already working on her tablet. We'd need to rapidly create parallel administrative systems with false data, then redirect their access without them realizing what happened. How long would that take? General Morrison asked. With the right resources and personnel, maybe 3 hours, Peterson estimated. But it's a massive risk. If we can't redirect them cleanly, we might end up giving them access to real systems. Sarah felt the familiar weight of decision-making under pressure. But this time the stakes were measured in national security rather than crop yields. Sir, in my experience, when you're dealing with a threat that's already inside your defenses, you have 2 choices. Try to push them out, which often causes them to do maximum damage on their way out, or convince them they've achieved their goals while actually giving them nothing of value. General Morrison stared at the main display, watching the continuing streams of false data and artificial communications. The decision he was being asked to make went against every conventional military instinct about containing security breaches, but the unconventional approach had already proven its value in dealing with this particular threat. "Do it," he said finally. "All available resources, full priority. And God help us all if this doesn't work." The command center had become a battlefield of minds with dozens of technicians working frantically to construct an elaborate digital deception while unseen adversaries continued their systematic infiltration of what they believed were critical military systems. Sarah found herself at the center of the most complex operation she'd ever been involved in, coordinating between technical teams and behavioral analysts as they raced against time to stay ahead of their sophisticated opponents.
Decoy administrative systems are 60% complete, Peterson reported, his voice hoarse from hours of continuous work.
"We've created false personnel databases, fabricated supply chain records, and generated dummy maintenance schedules that should look completely authentic to anyone analyzing them." Colonel Martinez monitored the intelligence aspects of the operation from her workstation, ensuring that the false information they were creating would be believable enough to satisfy careful scrutiny. The fabricated data needs to tell a consistent story about base operations and capabilities. If our adversaries are as sophisticated as they appear, they'll look for discrepancies that could reveal the deception. Sarah moved between workstations, applying lessons learned from managing complex agricultural systems to coordinate the various elements of their counter-operation. "The key is making sure all the false information reinforces the same narrative," she explained to a team of intelligence analysts. "On a farm, if you're trying to hide the true size of your livestock herd from tax assessors, every record has to support the same story. Feed purchases, veterinary records, facility maintenance, everything has to be consistent." General Morrison had remained in the command center throughout the night, monitoring progress and making resource allocation decisions as the operation expanded beyond its original scope. "Status report," he called out as the clock approached 4 a.m. "Sir, we're ahead of schedule on the technical implementation," Peterson replied. "The redirection protocols are ready, and we can begin steering their access toward the false systems within the next 30 minutes. Behavioral analysis shows they're still following predictable patterns," Sarah added. "Their artificial communications continue at regular intervals, and the administrative data they're targeting suggests they're looking for information about base personnel, operational schedules, and supply logistics, rather than trying to access weapons systems or classified military intelligence." "Which confirms your assessment that this is about disrupting operations rather than stealing secrets," General Morrison observed.
"Yes, sir."
"But there's something else," Sarah said, highlighting patterns on one of the main displays. "The specific types of administrative data they're targeting suggest they're planning something that requires detailed knowledge of our daily routines and personnel movements." Colonel Martinez looked up from her analysis with a frown. "What kind of something?" Sarah had been thinking about this possibility as she watched the data patterns evolve, drawing parallels to predator behavior she'd observed while protecting livestock. "If I were planning some kind of physical infiltration or attack on this base, I'd want to know exactly when security shifts change, when personnel move between buildings, when supply deliveries arrive, when maintenance activities create opportunities for concealment." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just dealing with a cyber attack designed to disrupt computer systems, they might be dealing with reconnaissance for a physical attack on the base itself. General Morrison immediately reached for his secure communication device. "I need security alert status raised to condition yellow, and I want a complete review of all scheduled activities for the next 72 hours. "Sir," Sarah interrupted carefully, "if we change security protocols now, it might alert them that we've detected their presence. They could accelerate their timeline or abandon their current approach in favor of something more unpredictable." The general paused, his fingers still poised over the communication device. "You're suggesting we maintain normal operations while potentially being scouted for physical attack. I'm suggesting we use the false administrative data to control what they think they know about our operations. Instead of changing our actual security posture, we change what they believe our security posture to be." Peterson was already pulling up system architecture diagrams. "We could feed them false information about security shift schedules, personnel movements, and facility access protocols. Make them plan for a situation that won't actually exist." Colonel Martinez nodded slowly. "It's an extension of the same principle we've been using. Instead of denying them information, we give them information that serves our purposes rather than theirs." General Morrison set down his communication device but kept his expression grave.
"Miss Mackenzie, you're asking me to potentially put this entire base at risk based on your assessment of behavioural patterns and agricultural analogies.
Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders, but she also felt the clarity that had always come to her in moments of critical decision-making. Sir, I'm asking you to trust that we can control the situation better by guiding it than by trying to stop it. But I understand if that's too much risk to accept based on my recommendations. For several moments, the only sounds in the command center were the humming of computers and the quiet conversations of technical teams continuing their work. General Morrison studied the displays showing their adversaries' activities, the progress of the deception operation, and the status of base security systems.
Proceed with the deception expansion, he said finally.
But I want immediate notification if there's any indication that we're losing control of the situation, and I want contingency plans for rapid lockdown procedures if this goes wrong. The next phase of the operation required unprecedented coordination between cybersecurity, intelligence analysis, and operational security teams. Sarah found herself serving as a liaison between groups that typically operated independently, translating technical requirements into behavioral strategies and helping each team understand how their work contributed to the overall deception. The false security schedule needs to show vulnerable periods that don't actually exist, she explained to the intelligence team. But those false vulnerabilities have to be believable based on normal military operational requirements. What kind of false vulnerabilities? Asked Captain Rodriguez, the intelligence analyst responsible for creating fictional security protocols. Sarah thought back to her experience analyzing predator behavior around the farm. Animals looking for opportunities to attack livestock always focus on transitions, times when animals are moving between secure areas, when attention is focused elsewhere, when normal defensive patterns are temporarily disrupted. She pulled up a calendar display showing normal base activities. For humans planning an attack, the same principles apply. They'll look for shift changes, meal times, scheduled maintenance, supply deliveries, any time when normal security attention might be divided, or when additional personnel movement could provide cover. So we create false information about security gaps during times when we'll actually have enhanced coverage, Captain Rodriguez said, understanding the strategy. Exactly. And we make sure the false information suggests that their best opportunities will occur at times when we're actually most prepared for them. As the deception operation reached full implementation, Sarah realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in military cybersecurity, a complete reversal of traditional defensive thinking. Instead of keeping adversaries out of their systems, they were inviting them deeper in while ensuring that everything they found served American interests rather than their own. Redirection is complete, Peterson announced. All their access requests are now being served by our false administrative systems. From their perspective, they should believe they have successfully infiltrated our personnel, logistics, and security databases. Monitoring shows they're accepting the false data as legitimate, added Sergeant Williams from the surveillance station. Their artificial communications are continuing normal patterns, and their data extraction activities suggest they believe they're accessing real military records. Sarah watched the streams of false information flowing to their hidden adversaries and felt a satisfaction similar to what she'd experienced when a carefully planned crop rotation scheme came together perfectly. Now we wait and watch to see what they do with the information we've given them. The waiting period that followed was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire operation. Everyone in the command center understood that they had potentially prevented a significant security breach, but they wouldn't know for certain until their adversaries either abandoned their activities or attempted to act on the false intelligence they'd been fed. During the tense hours that followed, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from a Nebraska farm to the center of a sophisticated counterintelligence operation. The skills that had served her in protecting crops and livestock had translated into protecting national security, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Careful observation, patient analysis, and the willingness to think beyond conventional approaches. General, we have activity, called out Sergeant Williams just after dawn. Multiple vehicles approaching the base perimeter from the eastern access road. General Morrison moved quickly to the surveillance monitors, where camera feeds showed 3 civilian vehicles moving toward the base at normal speed, but unusual timing. This is too early for scheduled deliveries or civilian contractor arrivals. Sarah studied the vehicle movements with the same focused attention she'd once applied to watching for predators approaching the farm. They're not trying to be stealthy, which means they believe their approach corresponds with the legitimate opportunity based on the false information we provided. Colonel Martinez was already coordinating with base security. Security teams are in position and ready. The approaching vehicles have no idea they're driving into enhanced defensive coverage instead of the security gap they think exists. Hold positions until we can determine their intentions, General Morrison ordered. If Miss Mackenzie's analysis is correct, They should attempt some kind of infiltration based on false intelligence about our security protocols. The tension in the command center was palpable as everyone watched the approaching vehicles. This was the moment when their unconventional strategy would either prove brilliantly successful or catastrophically misguided. The vehicle stopped at the outer perimeter checkpoint, where uniformed occupants presented what appeared to be legitimate civilian contractor credentials. The security guards followed standard verification procedures, unaware that this interaction was the culmination of weeks of cyber reconnaissance and counterintelligence operations. The credentials are sophisticated forgeries, Colonel Martinez reported, after rapid verification checks. They identify the occupants as maintenance contractors, scheduled to perform emergency repairs on Eastern Sector communication equipment. Repairs that would require access to the exact systems they've been studying through their cyber infiltration, Sarah observed. They're using the false information we provided to justify physical access to areas they believe are temporarily vulnerable, which means they would have had legitimate appearing access to critical infrastructure if we hadn't detected their cyber reconnaissance and fed them false information about our security procedures. The operation's final phase unfolded with military precision. Security teams, already positioned based on the false information the adversaries had received, were able to monitor and control the situation, while the infiltrators attempted to carry out a plan based on fundamentally inaccurate intelligence about base operations. All subjects are in custody, Captain Rodriguez reported as specialized security teams coordinated the detention operation. Initial questioning suggests they believe they were implementing a plan to access and disable critical communication infrastructure during a predicted security gap. Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction mixed with soberness as the immediate threat was neutralized. They had successfully prevented what could have been a devastating attack on base operations, but the sophistication of the attempt also revealed the evolving nature of threats to national security. Miss Mackenzie, General Morrison said as the command center began to return to normal operations, "I owe you an apology, sir. When you first walked into my office 6 weeks ago, I saw a farm girl who didn't understand the complexities of modern cyber warfare. What I failed to recognize was that you understood something more fundamental, how to think like both the protector and the threat simultaneously." Sarah reflected on everything that had happened since that first interview. "General, I think what I really understood was that the most sophisticated threats often succeed because they exploit assumptions about how defense should work. Sometimes the best way to protect something is to approach that protection from a completely different angle." Peterson approached their conversation with a tablet full of technical analysis. "Sarah, the operation we just completed is going to change how we approach cybersecurity throughout the military. The principles you've demonstrated, behavioral analysis, strategic deception, thinking beyond technical solutions, these are going to become standard elements of our defensive strategy. Which means," General Morrison added, "that your role here is going to expand significantly. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility and visibility?" Sarah thought about her grandfather's stories, about the principles he'd taught her about protecting what mattered, and about the unexpected path that had led her from rural Nebraska to national security operations. "Sir, I'm prepared to keep learning and growing into whatever role will let me contribute most effectively to protecting our country." "Then let's talk about what comes next," the general said with a slight smile. "Because what you've accomplished here is just the beginning." As the command center settled into its normal rhythm of monitoring and analysis, Sarah found herself looking forward to challenges she couldn't yet imagine. She'd proven that conventional thinking wasn't always the best approach to complex problems, and that sometimes the most valuable expertise came from the most unexpected backgrounds. The farm girl who had walked into General Morrison's office 6 weeks earlier had become something new, a strategic thinker who could bridge the gap between traditional wisdom and technological innovation. Her journey from agriculture to cybersecurity had taught her that protecting what matters most requires not just sophisticated tools, but the wisdom to understand when and how to use them. 3 months later, Sarah Mackenzie stood in the same command center, but now as the head of a new integrated defense unit that combined cybersecurity, behavioral analysis, and strategic deception. The program she'd helped create was being implemented at military installations across the country, training a new generation of defenders to think beyond conventional approaches to security. The farm girl who had claimed she didn't need a computer had become the architect of a revolutionary approach to cyber defense that emphasized human insight over technological complexity. Her success had proven that in an age of increasing digital sophistication, the most powerful weapon remained the human ability to understand patterns, anticipate behavior, and think creatively about protection and deception. As she reviewed the morning's threat assessments, Sarah often thought about her grandfather's lessons about responsibility and service. She had found her way to contribute to something larger than herself, using skills learned in the cornfields of Nebraska to protect the digital infrastructure of American democracy. The girl who had once fed chickens at dawn now spent her mornings analyzing global cyber threats, but the fundamental principles remained the same: careful observation, patient analysis, and the conviction that protecting what matters most is worth any level of effort and dedication. Her story had become proof that innovation often comes from the intersection of different worlds, and that sometimes the most effective solutions to complex problems emerge when someone with fresh perspective refuses to accept that things must be done the way they've always been done. Sarah's transformation from farm girl to national security strategist was complete, but her real work was just beginning. In an increasingly connected world where threats evolved constantly and traditional defenses often proved inadequate, her approach to security, grounded in behavioral understanding and strategic thinking, would continue to evolve and adapt, always staying one step ahead of those who would do harm to what she had dedicated her life to protecting. The base fell silent not in defeat, but in recognition that their most valuable asset was not their sophisticated technology, but the mind that knew how to use it wisely. Sarah Mackenzie had proven that, in the digital age, the most powerful defense remained distinctly human: the ability to understand, anticipate, and outthink any threat, no matter how sophisticated or unexpected it might be.